Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. I hope you guys are all doing really well. So it's been a little while since I've done a reading wrap up, and I think the last one I did was back in June sometime. So we're gonna wrap up my recent reads, and I think I'm probably going to do these. I'm not sure if I'll do them monthly or just kind of do them whenever I feel like there's enough to talk about. I've been, and I've talked about this before, I've been in like one of the worst slumps that I've been in probably 4 or 5 years, and it's just been awful. So I am starting to come out of that reading slump, but I'm still reading kind of less than what I do normally. And I think part of that is, you know, I started a new job recently, so I think a lot of my brain power has kind of gone to learning a new job, and this has been the first time I've been back in an office in 3.5 years. So there was that, and you know, it's been summer and we've been kind of out and about more than we usually are. We're, you know, pretty much introverts, but we've been out quite a bit this summer. So I think everything all together, you know, looped in with the fact that I'm just coming out of a reading slump, has just kind of, you know, really taken a toll on my reading. And I think this is the first time I've ever been behind in my Goodreads challenge, which that's just a goal. It's not a big deal. And so I'm going to talk to you guys about what I've read over the past couple of months. And I have to say that I think I've read some of my favorite books of the year, if not, you know, even in the past couple of years, in the past few months. And so I'm really excited to talk to you guys about those as well. So jumping right into the wrap up here, I did have one DNF, and my DNF and my least favorite read of what I've read recently were both Christopher Pike books, which is really disappointing because if you've been around here a while, you know that Christopher Pike was one of my favorite authors growing up, and he still remains so because I love vintage YA horror. But these ones just, I don't know, they just didn't do it for me. So the DNF was The Wicked Heart, and I think this is probably one of his more least liked books. So I didn't feel too bad when I ended up DNFing it. So this is about, basically, you're seeing things through the mind of a serial killer, and he's basically killing his classmates. That's not a spoiler, it's just, you know, what the whole book is about, and you're seeing things from his perspective. And the book actually started out quite well and I was really enjoying it, but then it went completely bizarre and totally off the wall, which some of Christopher Pike's writing definitely is, but this one was just, it was way too out there, and all of a sudden there was like crazy stuff getting involved, and it just got away from what I thought that the book was going to be about. And it was just, it was a little too bizarre, it was a little too weird for me, and I was like, you know what? It was one of those ones that was just sitting on my Kindle on my nightstand, and I was watching TikTok videos instead of reading before bed. And I knew after a few days, I'm like, I'm not enjoying this. So I just completely gave up on it. So unfortunately, the one DNF that I had was a Christopher Pike book. And then my least favorite book of the past couple of months was Spellbound by Christopher Pike. And I didn't dislike this book, it was just out of everything that I read, this was one that I liked the least. And of course, as with a lot of 90s YA stuff, there are things in there that didn't age well, so those kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. But, you know, it wasn't too bad, and of course, like I said, with the time period, it is to be expected. It's just the way that the writing was back then. So if you don't know anything about this book, basically, it's about this boyfriend and girlfriend, and they go on a hike up a mountain, and she ends up supposedly getting mauled by a bear. And she dies, the boyfriend survives, and he's telling the story like to the cops and interviews and stuff like that about what happened. And of course there's skeptics out there that think that he's responsible for, you know, supposedly murdering her, and you know, things just aren't really adding up to it being a bear. And then so this, the boyfriend actually starts dating a new girl, but it's kind of like in the back of her mind of like, you know, what if he really is responsible for that? And this actually had a pretty cool premise. There's a lot of like mysticism and otherworldliness and other religions kind of wrapped around into this. And it was actually a pretty cool story. but you know, it didn't hit me the right way. So I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. So it wasn't terrible, like I said, but it was my least favorite book. So, I mean, to have a 3-star read as your least favorite book of the past few months, there's nothing wrong with that. And then next up I read the Llewellyn's 2023 Sabbaths Almanac, Rituals, Crafts, Recipes, and Folklore. So I used to buy these. So Llewellyn puts these out every single year, and they go from Samhain to the following Mabon. And I used to read these every single year when I was a younger witch, and after a while I just kind of got out of reading them, and I was, you know, developing more of my own stuff and doing my own ritual and stuff like that. So I just stopped buying them after a while, and I actually bought this one at Yule time last year and hadn't picked it up. So because I was in such a bad reading slump and I was feeling just really disjointed and like just I needed to reconnect, I picked it up, and I'm really, really glad that I did, because I did learn some new rituals and recipes and stuff like that, and just reading about the changing of the seasons, and of course we're coming up on fall now, so it kind of got me in the mood for that as well. So if you're into any kind of Wicca, paganism, witchcraft, anything like that, you know, even if you're not practicing yourself, these are really, really great books, because it just discusses different aspects of the seasons and you know, the moon's effects on the earth. And like I said, it has lots of recipes in there and kind of that kind of thing, and they're just a lot of fun. So you can get these off of Amazon, or you know, most metaphysical shops do carry them. So like I said, I was really glad that I picked this up. You know, if I would give it a star rating, I would say it was a 4-star read, and I just had a lot of fun with it. And like I said, it just put me really, really in the mood to be excited about fall and Halloween hunting and all of that kind of stuff. And it was probably one of the books that started to bring me out of that slump. It started to make me really excited about reading again. So I was happy about that, and I had some really great reads after this one as well. So everything kind of complemented each other really well this month. And I actually had the majority of the rest of the books that I read were all Gothic books. And I did the Gothic Hearts reading challenge, which I've mentioned a couple of times, way back in February of this year. And I've always loved Gothic stories and horror and all of that kind of thing. But I hadn't actually read a lot of Gothic horror myself. It just was one of those things where it's like it was always on my list, but I never ever picked it up. And a lot of them, of course, are classics that were adapted into movies, and I thought, okay, well, I've seen the movie 100 times, I don't really want to read the same story again. But the Gothic books that I read just blew me out of the water. I had so much fun with them. So ever since February, I've been reading a lot of classics and a lot of Gothic horror, and I've been just having so much fun with it. So I did read The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is, it's not a novel, it's a short story, and I read this one on Audible. If you do have an Audible subscription, it is included. And of course, everybody knows the story about Dr. Jekyll, who also has an alter ego or a split personality with Mr. Hyde. And he thinks, you know, at the beginning it's very freeing and, you know, all of that sort of thing, and he's really enjoying it. But then he kind of starts to lose himself, and he starts to lose control on, you know, his shape-shifting and everything. And this was written beautifully. I really enjoyed the writing of it. It really felt like, almost like, you know, Victorian London. And so it was a fantastic book. I read it in a couple of days. And actually one of the things that I've really been enjoying, because I've been going back and forth to an office every day for the first time in almost 4 years, I've been reading a lot more audiobooks. Usually I only read like 1 audiobook a month that I would get with my credit with Audible, but I'm reading audiobooks every day now, and it's great to just pop it on, and it's about a 40-minute drive to the office and then home. So, you know, I can get a fair amount of reading done during that commute. So this one was definitely one that I enjoyed, and, you know, it was a 4-star read. Like I said, I'm pretty sure everybody knows of the story, but if you haven't picked up this classic, it is one that I would highly recommend finally picking up. And then along the same lines, I also read The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. And this was my first time reading this one as well. Of course, it's a classic. And I had originally seen the movie with Daniel Radcliffe that came out, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. And it is definitely a Gothic spooky, you know, story, but it is slow moving, and it's very slow paced. So I didn't ever watch the movie because I overtly enjoyed the story. It was more for the atmosphere, so I would put it on in the background while I was on my computer or, you know, on my phone or something, because I loved the atmosphere of it so much. And so I finally picked up the book. This one was also included in my Audible subscription, and I was gobbling up Gothic fiction this month. And of course, this is about a lawyer who goes to a small town to take care of an older lady's estate after she dies, and there's a woman in black in the town that basically, if you see her, it's an omen, and all kinds of ominous things start happening. And I have to say, after I read this book, I was so upset at the movie, because the story, there's so much more to the story. It's so much different than what they adapted into the movie, that I was like, why didn't they just stick to the regular story? It's such an amazing book. So I had gotten really frustrated, and I was so happy that I finally picked up the original story, the original book, and Susan Hill's writing is just so good. So I definitely want to read her other classic books that most horror lovers have read. So like I said, classics just aren't something that I've picked up recently, and I definitely want to rectify that. So this one was really good. It had all of the ambiance and the atmosphere of, you know, all of the spooky. The only thing that I didn't like about it was the audio was a little bit weird, and I didn't enjoy the sound effects that they had. So when I was listening to the narrator reading and really sinking into the story, like if he was talking about a creaky door, like they would actually have the sound of a creaky door, and it would be louder than what the narrator's voice was. So it was kind of jarring, and I didn't really enjoy that. I'm sure some people probably do enjoy that kind of stuff with their audiobooks, but it just wasn't for me. But talking about the book itself, it was definitely a 4-star read. I really enjoyed it. And then moving right along with our classics, I also read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, again through my Audible subscription. And this is another one that I had never picked up, but the adaptation that has Ciarán Hinds in it and Samantha Morton, I believe it came out in about 2003, 2004. It was one of my favorite movies of all time. I watch it every single year, and I just love it. And I love Ciarán Hinds as Mr. Rochester. He does such a fantastic job. And I think probably out of all of the classics, you know, like Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice and all of those, I think it is absolutely my favorite. Wuthering Heights was a favorite for a long time, but I think Jane Eyre is just the epitome of a Gothic story. And it has everything in it. Again, it's got the spooky atmosphere. It's got, you know, if you're into romance, it's got that aspect and that sort of thing. So like I said, I had only ever seen the movie, so I finally, because it was included with my Audible subscription, I finally picked it up and I listened to it on my drive to and from work, and it was just so good. It was just as good as the adaptation. The only thing was Mr. Rochester was a lot more cruel, I guess you would say, or rude and abrupt in the book, more so than he was in the movie, and it kind of took me off guard a little bit, and I really didn't like him. Just the way that he talked about Adele and her situation and all of that, I really didn't like it, but it is still one of my favorite stories of all time. It's probably my favorite Gothic story of all time, and if you haven't read this one, basically it's about this young girl named Jane Eyre who is an orphan herself. She grew up through like a school type institution for orphans, and she became a teacher herself, and she gets hired as a governess in this big stately manor. that's owned by Mr. Rochester, obviously, and she is the governess for his ward, Adele. And she's really enjoying her time at the manor, but spooky things start happening, and, you know, things aren't adding up. And she thinks that there's a ghost in the manor, and it really does have that wonderful Gothic atmosphere. I love this story so much, so just popping it on and listening to it every day was such a joy. And then of course I had to watch the Karen Hines adaptation again, and even my husband was like, didn't you watch this not long ago? And I was like, yeah, but I just finished the book, so I have to watch it again. So if you are looking for an adaptation, that one is definitely my favorite, so I'd highly recommend it. And the next two books that I read, both in the Gothic genre, are Hester Fox books. So my love affair with Hester Fox continues. I've been so enjoying her stories this year, and yeah, I only picked her up this year, so this is my third and fourth book that I've read by her. And she is just so fantastic, and I'm amazed that there's not more people speaking about her writing, because it's just so wonderfully Gothic. And I think whether you're into supernatural sort of spooky horror, or you're into romance or contemporary or whatever, I think she can appeal to a lot of people. And she's just fantastic. So two books, like I said, I read from her this month, and I ended up lucking into getting a second audiobook for just a couple of dollars. I had gotten an email from Audible saying that her books were on sale, so I did get a second one. But the first one that I read was the last Heir to the Blackwood Library. And this one, I think this was the book that really snapped me out of that reading slump and started to kickstart my reading and find my love of reading again. And it's funny because this is very much a book about books and about a library, obviously, given the title. So basically this is about a young woman, and she finds out that she had a distant relative who was super rich, and he was a lord, and he had this manor. She's the last, of course, she's the last surviving blood relative, so she inherits the whole thing. But the only catch is that she has to live at Blackwood Manor. So this book actually really reminded me a lot of Rebecca, in that, you know, it's a young woman who's from the city. This takes place in the 1920s. So she's a young woman from the city, and she moves into this manor, and she really doesn't know what she's doing. She's not an aristocrat. She's not a noble. So she's starting to clash a little bit with the household staff, and they're very secretive. And there's a lot of things that, you know, just don't add up with Blackwood. So she finds this massive library in the manor, and it has all the feel-good stuff that you love about books, the smell of books, the feel of books. She talks about a lot of the classics, so she starts to actually loan the books out to people, and spooky things start happening, and I really enjoyed this aspect. And of course there's, you know, the big ladders that go up into the stacks of books, and there's even like secret bookshelf passages. So all of those aspects just started to snap me out of this reading slump, and I really was brought back to why I love books. And so that's not the only part of the story. So like I said, spooky manor, secretive staff. She's really clashing with the, what would you call her? The head housekeeper. She's really clashing with her. And her and I believe he's a driver. They're very secretive, like I said, and she's really clashing with them. And she meets another lord from another family, a very well-to-do family there, and she, you know, starts to have romantic feelings, and she's being told, you know, to stay away from him and all this stuff, but he's just really nice and dashing. So is it that, you know, he's good or is he bad? And there's occult stuff in here. There's nuns that are bricked up in walls. There's if you've ever seen The Ninth Gate with Johnny Depp, it kind of has those sorts of aspects kind of wrapped into it, with this occult book and secret societies. So it has this multi-layered story, and by the time I was 3/4 of the way through, I'm like, how is she gonna tie all this together? Because I was starting to think, like, are there gonna be plot holes? There's a lot going on. But everything managed to come full circle into this fantastic story, and I cried at the end. I finished it on my drive home one night, and I was about 10 minutes away from home, and I came home and I had to tell Matthew all about it, and I really enjoyed this book. So full 5 stars. If you're into Gothic horror, Gothic literature, definitely recommend this one. And Hester Fox books, I find, are best if you read them on audio, because you do get that spooky atmospheric sort of aspect to your reading pleasure. So definitely pick this one up. I believe this one is her most recent book that came out earlier this year, maybe late last year, and definitely one of my favorite books, I think, of 2023 so far. And then the other Hester Fox book that I read was A Lullaby for Witches, and I was really excited to pick this one up as well. This one is about, so it's a split timeline. So you have basically a family that lived back in the 1800s, and you know, they were just a normal family, but the daughter is basically a witch, and she's so different from her family. So it goes through her whole situation as a witch, and she is a little bit of a vengeful witch. So there's a whole story around that, and you really do feel for this young woman from that time. And then there's a story that happens in modern times, and this young woman who, I believe she has a master's degree in like museum and cataloging and stuff like that, like museum studies. And so she goes to work at a historical home that was actually the home of this family with the witch daughter from back in the day. And she starts to experience some strange things, really weird things that she's never had happen before. And she basically has a connection with this young woman. So there's this whole story that's kind of bouncing back and forth between time, but they're completely intertwined. And it was so heart-wrenching to hear what happened to this young woman back in the day and how she was treated, of course, because, you know, young women who were suspected of witchcraft weren't exactly treated very well back then. And so they had a whole intertwining story, and then of course, you know, it has the wonderful spooky atmosphere of like historical home, both back then and in modern day. The only thing that I can't say I didn't like, but the only thing that, you know, wasn't entirely for me was this one was heavier with romance than some of the other Hester Fox books, which all of them have a romantic element in it. But the spookiness and the gothicness and the supernatural and the hauntings and all of that, I don't mind a little bit of romance if it has those other elements and it adds to the story. But this one was quite heavy with the romance. It wasn't a turnoff at all, because like I said, it you know, it had a purpose and it was wound in with all those other elements. But it was just a little bit heavier than the other ones. And so that tied together with one aspect in the book that one of the characters is talking about, that really made me roll my eyes. It completely turned me off, and it was such a small section of the book, but I was like, this doesn't add anything to the story. It really didn't need to be in there. So those two aspects, both related to romance, I rounded this one down to a 4.5 star read. So I still really enjoyed this one. But like I said, it is a little bit heavier on the romance than the other ones. So I didn't enjoy it quite as much. But I have to say, this one I think is probably right up there with my favorite reads of the year as well. And then the last book that I read this month, just finished it yesterday, is Carrie by Stephen King. And of course, this was King's first published novel that he had written. And like most people, I've seen the movie 100 times, of course, with Sissy Spacek. And the audiobook that I actually read is read by her. So I thought that was a fantastic addition to the audiobook. And I have to say, this was so good. It's 1000% better than the movie, and you can really see the difference in the character of Carrie between the movie adaptation and the book. In the book, she's a little bit bigger. She has problems with her skin. You know, she what you would consider plump, I guess, which of course Sissy Spacek was not at all. So you could definitely see the differences between the two. But the thing that I really enjoyed, I'd say the three things I really enjoyed about the book that didn't come through in the movie. Number one is, even though I loved Piper Laurie as Carrie's mom in the movie adaptation, she's just so cruel. But Mrs. White in the book is way worse. She's way worse, and there's a lot more emphasis put on the relationship between Carrie and her mom, and actually her mom's backstory in the book. So I really liked that. I really liked the differences between the characters, seeing the differences between the characters of Carrie in both adaptations. And the third thing is that the way the story is told in the book, it's from different points of view, and it's almost like afterwards, where people have written articles and books and interviews and stuff like that about the situation that happened at the prom. And it almost reminded me of reading Helter Skelter, and I really like that aspect as well. This was a super short read. I think the entire thing was 6 hours, and so I listened to my books typically at a 1.5 speed. And so it was about 4 hours long. I had read the first couple of hours sort of a little while ago, and then I picked it up again and finished it, and it's just so good. I think this one has to be one of my favorite classic horrors as well. I also read The Exorcist this year. You guys probably remember that was another one that was a favorite of this year as well. So I've read a ton of classics, whether you're talking about like horror classics like The Exorcist and Carrie and stuff like that. And I've also read a ton of Gothic literature classics like Jane Eyre, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Woman in Black, and I'm going to continue that because I've just been having all of the Gothic horror feels, and I've really enjoyed picking up those classics that I've never picked up before. So that's going to continue on probably during the rest of the year. And for right now, what am I reading? Oh, I've been on a bit of a ghost story kick, so I'm reading a lot of ghost stories. I finally started How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix, so I got that one out of this month's Audible credit, so I'll be reading that on my travels to and from work. And I'm reading a Darcy Coates right now, which I'm about 50% through. So really enjoying reading the ghosty books. I've been reading, like I said, all of the Gothic horror, and there's a stack of books that I want to read, you know, before the end of the year sort of things. There's definitely ones on my list that I want to read before the end of the year. So if you guys are interested in a video like that where I discuss the kinds of books that I want to read before the end of 2023, let me know down in the comments. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching and listening to my recent reads. Let me know if you guys have read any of these books and enjoyed them, didn't like them. You guys know I love having discussions with you. But until next time, stay spooky, everybody.